All right, guys, this is going to be our last quadratic unit video, and I want to introduce you to an idea called completing the square. So I'm just going to introduce you to this idea, and we're going to use it to solve quadratic equations. So this will be another way we're able to solve quadratic equations. And so let's go back to what we mean by completing the square. First of all, in order to complete the square, the leading coefficient must be 1. So I have to have a 1 in front of my x squared. If there's not a 1, then we have to divide that out. And for this video, I'm just going to show you ones that have a leading coefficient of 1. Our goal is to try to get the equation to look like parentheses squared equals some number. Because then what we can do is use our other method of taking the square root on both sides in order to solve that. So let me remind you about what this perfect square looks like, a perfect square trinomial. When I have something that is parentheses squared, what that means, remember, is that I have a parenthesis times itself. So if I FOIL that out, that would give me x squared plus 3x plus 3x plus 9. And then when I combine those like terms, I get x squared plus 6x plus 9. So what I want you to notice is that the middle term, the 6, how does that relate to this 3 that's in the parentheses squared? So the 6 is 2 times the 3, right? And then the 9, that's whatever the 3 is, that's squared. So if I wanted to figure out, if I was just given a thing that looks like this, x squared plus 6x, and I wanted to know what goes here to make that a perfect square trinomial, I want to somehow get to 9 right here. So if I want to get from 6 to 9, what would I do? Well, I'm going to go from 6 back to this 3. So if I wanted to somehow get to from 6 to 3, I would divide it by 2, right? So 6 divided by 2 gives me 3. So now I'm with this number that's in the parentheses. And we just said that the way we get to 9 from the 3 is by squaring it. So I'm going to be doing 3 squared, and that would give me the 9. So our rule is, if I have some number, let's make sure that that's separate from this. If I have some number, let's say it's x squared plus 10x, and I want to know what goes here, in order to get back to that number that I was in parentheses, I have to divide this middle term, this 10, I have to divide that by 2. So I have to do 10 divided by 2, that would be 5. So I know 5 would have been in that parenthesis. And then to get to that last number, I would do 5 squared, and that would be 25. So I know that this would be, in order to make that a perfect square trinomial, that would be 25. Let's do a few more like that, just so we get the idea of what a perfect square is. I'm going to move this down a little bit. All right, so going back up here. So let's do another practice. Okay, so if I had, let's say, x squared minus 8x, and I want to fill in the blank there. So I would take my 8, my negative 8, and I would say negative 8 divided by 2, that gives me negative 4. And now I'm going to take that negative 4 and I'm going to square that. That would give me positive 16. So I know positive 16 goes in that blank. So why do we care about this perfect square trinomial? Well, the reason I care about that is because this can factor to something that looks like parentheses squared. Okay, so if I were to actually factor this, if I were to say, okay, what two numbers multiply to give me 16, add to give me negative 8, well, that's going to be negative 4 and negative 4. Notice that they're going to be always the same number. That's the whole point of doing that. So I could write x minus 4 quantity squared. So here's the idea, guys. Here's how we're going to use this when we're solving quadratic equations. If I have something sorry, my board's messing up. If I have something like x squared plus bx equals some number, then we're going to add b divided by 2 squared to each side. And what is b? Remember, b is just that middle number. So for example, in this example above, the negative 8 was my b. So remember, we did negative 8 divided by 2, and then we squared that number. So that's what we're going to be adding to both sides. So if I had the equation x squared plus 14x equals 5, then I would want to make sure that I'm adding the same thing on both sides. Remember, we can add the same thing on both sides of an equation. So what is that one thing that I'm going to be adding? I'm going to be adding the b divided by 2 and squared. So here's my b, 14. So I'm going to do 14 divided by 2, and I'm going to square it. So what is 14 divided by 2? That's 7. And then if I do 7 squared, that's 49. So in this equation, I would know I'm going to add 49 to both sides. Okay? So let's do an example from beginning to end using these ideas that we've just been talking about. So we're going to solve this example by completing the square. So first things first, you always want to make sure that you have x squared plus bx equals some number. So I don't want this on that side. I want to move that over there. So I'm going to do that by adding 2. All right, so x squared minus 2x equals positive 2. Okay, now we have the setup that we were just talking about. So we're trying to figure out what number do I have to add to that to make it a perfect square trinomial. And whatever that is, I'm going to be adding it to the other side as well. Okay, so here's we're going to do b divided by 2 squared. What's our b? Our b is negative 2. We're dividing it by 2, and we're going to square that. So negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. When I square that, that gives me positive 1. So I'm adding positive 1 to both sides. So my equation looks like this so far. X squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 3. And remember, we said the whole point of completing the square is so that I can factor it. This comes out to be a nice factored result. So if you need to, go ahead and draw your diamond over to the side. That would be 1 and negative 2. So both of those numbers would have to be x minus 1, x minus 1. Okay? They should be the same thing. If not, then you're either factoring wrong or you completed the square incorrectly. Now, again, the whole point of doing that is so that I can write x minus 1 quantity squared. Okay? So why do I want to get it like that? Well, remember from way back at the beginning of this unit, we said we could take the square root of both sides if I have something squared. So I'm going to have x minus 1. Remember, the square and the square root cancel. Over on the right-hand side, we have plus or minus square root of 3. And now we only have one more step, and that's to add the 1 on both sides. So I have x equals 1 plus or minus square root of 3. And we are finished. We have solved by completing the square. Let's do 2 more examples so you get the hang of it. All right, so on the back, we're solving by completing the square. Always get that constant to the other side. So I'm going to have x squared plus 12x equals negative 3. Now we're trying to decide what will help complete the square on the left-hand side, and whatever that is, I will also be adding that to the right-hand side. To help us do that, remember we are doing b divided by 2 squared. So in this example, my b is 12. So 12 divided by 2 squared. 12 divided by 2 is 6. When I square 6, that gives me 36. So that's the number that goes in the blank here, 36 and 36. So I'm going to rewrite what I've got on my equation. X squared plus 12x plus 36 equals 33. Now we're going to factor this. If you need to, go ahead and do this. But I know that's going to be 6 and 6. Hey, have you noticed that this number that gets repeated, that's the same number that's being squared there. So if you want, you can use that as a shortcut so you don't have to go through all the thinking of factoring. Okay, so now that we have parentheses squared equals some number, we can take the square root on both sides. So I'm going to have x plus 6 equals plus or minus square root of 33, and I cannot pull square root of 33 apart. It's just 3 and 11. So now I'm going to subtract the 6 on both sides, and that'll give me negative 6 plus or minus square root of 33. And we are finished with that problem. All right, last one. All right, we've got a big number here. Negative, subtract that, 76 on both sides first. So I'm going to have x squared minus 16x equals negative 76. We need to figure out what are we going to add to complete the square. That will go on both sides. So remember, b divided by 2 squared. So our b in this situation is negative 16. So negative 16 divided by 2 is negative 8. And then when I square negative 8, that gives me positive 64. So 64 goes in those blanks. I'm going to rewrite my equation. And negative 76 plus 64, that's going to give me a negative 12. And then you can either factor on the left-hand side, or did you remember what I said about what it'll look like factored? It'll be this number right here. Will be in both of those. It'll be x minus 8, x minus 8. So I'm going to have x minus 8 squared equals negative 12. Now when we do the square root part, we're going to be square rooting a negative number. Remember, we know how to handle that because we know about imaginary numbers. So I'm going to have plus or minus I square root of 12 okay, and remember we can also pull apart the 12. Remember, that can break down into square root of 4 and square root of 3. So that's going to be 2 square root of 3. So I'm going to rewrite this. So this is x minus 8 equals plus or minus 2i square root of 3. And our last step, add that 8 over to the other side. All right, so that is completing the square, and all we're doing is using that to solve. So it gives you an idea of completing the square. We will do a lot more examples in class.